Hey yo, how's it going? Welcome back to Wicked Whimsy. Today we're going to be reviewing the movie Cobweb, which flew under my radar completely. It came out the same weekend as Barbie and Oppenheimer, and let me just say that this movie deserved a lot more attention than it got, and it's available on VOD right now. But without further ado, let's get into it. So I want to go ahead and start off with the positives for this movie. First of all, the cinematography was absolutely amazing. The shots were gorgeously lined up. The lighting was beautiful. It honestly is probably one of the most beautiful horror movies I've ever seen, which is high praise because I watch a lot of horror. Also, it really looked like Halloween to me, and this movie does take place around the holiday, and one of my biggest pet peeves is with horror movies or movies that take place around Halloween. Sometimes we don't get the Halloween feel. For example, Scream 6 takes place on Halloween in New York, and I just didn't really get the Halloween feel from that movie. Now, it is one of my favorite horror movies of this year, but I really wish that they would have gone all out on the Halloween decorations. Instead, we get a lot of Halloween costumes, but other than that, you just don't really get that feel. This movie is completely the opposite. The trees are fall colors. There are pumpkins and Halloween decorations just everywhere in this movie. So if you are looking for a Halloween movie to start off the season, this is definitely one to go to. I also want to specifically mention the lighting in this movie. It is the best that I've seen in a horror movie this year. The way that they played with shadows in the house that they were filming in really nailed this storybook vibe, and it was really beautiful to watch in every single frame. Now, Cody Leach, another horror movie reviewer, is the guy who made me interested in this movie. And in his review of this movie, he says that this movie reminds him of a fairy tale, and I couldn't put it any better. And without giving away too much, this movie feels like a Halloween version of Rapunzel. There are even a couple of times in this film that the story of Rapunzel is directly mentioned by certain shots that are lined up or storytelling elements, and to me this is one of the most intriguing parts about the movie. I just feel like that was a very unique approach, and I was kind of infatuated with it the entire time. Another one of my positives is the performance of the three main characters, played by Woody Norman, Anthony Starr, and Lizzie Kaplan. Now, I'd like to mention here that the performance of Lizzie Kaplan in the role of Carol, Peter's mom, really caught me off guard, because initially I just felt that her performance was very wooden and very stiff, but then I realized that it was a certain character choice that she was making to make herself more unnerving, and as the movie went on, I realized how dynamic it actually was, and she really sold the character for me. In fact, it was probably my favorite performance in this entire movie. Both her and Anthony Starr as Pete's father, Mark, really stole the show for me, and I actually found myself a few times in this movie being genuinely unsettled, which is saying a lot because I'm pretty desensitized to horror movies, and that's the closest I get to actually being scared, so I was really impressed with that aspect. Now, this movie subverted my expectations a handful of times, which is very refreshing in a horror movie. It's not detrimental to my enjoyment of a horror film. For example, Evil Dead Rise, which also came out this year, was pretty much exactly what I was expecting it to be, but the execution was so well done that I ended up walking out of that movie really happy with the time that I had spent in the theater just because it was done so well. This movie, on the other hand, just took a few turns that I wasn't quite expecting, and it really added to the overall enjoyment of the film. But on the topic of expectations, I would like to talk about them later in the negative section. But in terms of positives, the third act was visually very surprising to me and included a sequence that I think any horror fan would enjoy. Oh, also, I would just like to thank the director Samuel Bowden for keeping this movie to an hour and 30, well, an hour and 27 actually. The movie felt very concise, which is kind of a rarity these days. It told the story it needed to without over-embellishing in unnecessary shots or storytelling elements, and I really appreciate that. For my last topic in the positive section, this movie takes place in mostly one location, which is the house. There are a few scenes that take place in the school, but outside of that, it's all taking place at this house, and I just want to say that the set for this house was absolutely beautiful. In my opinion, it's right up there with The Haunting of Hill House in terms of beauty. Now, Haunting of Hill House was much bigger, more grandiose and such, but this movie really captured the beauty that I was so infatuated with in Haunting of Hill House. So moving on to the negatives. Starting out with these, I just want to talk about one character in particular, Miss Devine, who is Peter's teacher. She just didn't sell her performance to me. The actress's name is Cleopatra Coleman, and while I do believe that she has the talent to be in a role like this, I just didn't really believe her performance. It did feel a little bit wooden to me. But I do appreciate the presence of her character because it was necessary, in my opinion. Speaking of characters, there are a few that show up in the third act that I just couldn't allow any room for suspension of disbelief when it came to their actions. But ultimately, they were kind of throwaway characters, so it didn't take me out of the film too much. Especially especially since they were in my favorite sequence of the movie. Another element I found to be completely unbelievable was that Peter was bullied by literally everybody in his class. Now, there was one main bully, but everybody else in the class and around him hated Peter, and I just couldn't believe that. That's just not how bullying works in real life. That's how bullying works in movies. And this is the reason why Miss Divine cared so much for Peter, which I do think is a good enough reason, but again, I just don't think Cleopatra sold it enough for me to believe. Back on the topic of expectations and subverting them, unfortunately, a little over a quarter into this movie, I guessed the end of the movie, and that was really disappointing to me. The big reveal was pretty much exactly what I expected it to be, and that really just kind of made me sad, but I do think that the big reveal was pulled off relatively well, and so this one is almost a mixed area of the movie for me. I didn't hate it, I didn't love it, but I do think that it was done well. Also, again, without saying too much, I did notice some inspiration from the Babadook start to trickle its way into this movie, and I did enjoy that aspect. But my last negative for this movie is that the ending raised more questions than it answered, in my opinion. It left me wondering why certain characters wouldn't have done things differently if they understood the gravity of the situation that they were in. It's one of those where you start to think about the logistics of it, and you kind of just go, huh? Like, that's not how somebody would actually deal with that situation. But it is a horror movie, so that is to be expected. That does happen often in horror movies, so it wasn't too hard to wrap my head around. But yeah, I just feel like if you don't think about it too deeply, then you will be fine. The movie is effective enough that you don't really have to ask the questions to enjoy it fully. My overall consensus of the movie, this is a Halloween treat. This is up there with Trick or Treat and Ginger Snaps for me in terms of Halloween aesthetic. And if you have seen either of those movies, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This movie is absolutely worth checking out, especially since it's relatively short. An hour and 27 minutes. It is well worth your time. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10, and I absolutely will be watching this one every Halloween. That's gonna be all for today. If you made it to this part of the video, I just want to thank you. I appreciate you so much. Please like and subscribe, as it helps me reach my goal of 50 subscribers, and we will catch you in the next one.